Good evening, Secretary Kissinger, Ambassador Power, Dr. Heusgen, President-elect Steinberg, ministers, excellencies, members of parliaments, friends and supporters of the American Academy in Berlin, ladies and gentlemen. The year at the American Academy is marked by three highlights: the presentation of the fall semester fellows, the presentation of the next semester's fellows, and the award of the Henry Kissinger Prize. There can be a fourth, a fifth, a sixth highlight if a fellow or one of our distinguished visitors delivers an especially sparkling lecture, which happens actually quite frequently. In her recent book on the founder of the American Academy, Richard Holbrook, which is titled The Unquiet American, Samantha Power said about Richard, "Holbrook placed a premium on knowing something about something. He prized knowledge that came from experience in the field, but equally that came from books and articles." That is a pretty good description of what the American Academy in Berlin is about. And I welcome all of you, but especially Secretary Kissinger and Ambassador Power, to this highlight of our year. And within that highlight, Henry, your annual visit is itself a highlight. Richard Holbrook and may there be many more years of these annual visits. Richard Holbrook, when serving as the US Permanent Representative to the United Nations from 1999 until 2001, did yeoman's work to persuade the Congress that the United States needed to pay the roughly $1 billion in dues that it then owed. The kind of problem you have been spared, Samantha. He began this effort with a dinner for a Republican senator at the Waldorf Astoria, which at least two people present tonight attended, Kati Marton and Henry Kissinger. One staff member of the US mission to the UN alleged that no cabinet member in any administration since the dawn of time visited as many congressmen as Richard Holbrook. The point that Holbrook made over and over again to members of Congress and to the general public was that the United States needed the United Nations in order to engage the world. I quote, "American leaders of both parties have called the UN vital to our national security. The reason is simple. For all its faults, its inefficiencies, and its shortcomings, if the UN did not exist, we would have to invent it. We therefore need the UN as a place where nations with common interests can come together, a place, in the words of the UN Charter, to harmonize the actions of nations towards common ends." Of course, Holbrook also quotes from a speech that Adlai Stevenson gave in Chicago in 1945. "The Charter is only paper, no better and no worse than the will and intentions of its 5 major members." If the term major member is not defined by reference to a permanent seat on the Security Council with veto power, Germany certainly has become, or maybe I should say has the potential to become, a major member as measured by the level of its political, financial, and now even military engagement with the United Nations. In the past, at these occasions, other aspects of the transatlantic relationship have been in the foreground. The American Academy's decision to award the Kissinger Prize to Samantha Power as a significant scholar and as a practitioner of United States foreign policy in the United Nations is an indication of the importance the United Nations have for the transatlantic relationship. And I'm just very pleased that when we talked earlier, Samantha and I talked earlier in the library about the job, she said, it is the perfect job. We are very happy to have somebody at the United Nations who believes it is a perfect job. In a recent book, Samantha Power made reference to the plagues that preoccupy us today: civil war, refugee flows, religious extremism, suppressed national and religious identity, genocide, and terrorism. Seeing these plagues as challenges, we are very fortunate to have people like Samantha Power, Christoph Heusgen, and, of course, Henry Kissinger to think about them and about how to find solutions. I give you Henry Kissinger.
Gerhard and friends, it has become customary that I say a few words in German before I go into my comments for two reasons. One, to show my connection to the country in which I was born. And secondly, to give Gerhard and others here an opportunity to contrast the pronunciation of Fürth with the pronunciation of northern Germany. And Samantha, to people of Berlin, my accent sounds like that of Mississippi to you. So, if you permit me, I'll say a few words in German. Vor 2 Jahrzehnten hat mich Richard Holbrook zu einem Frühstück eingeladen. Wenn man Richard Holbrook kannte, ist das Wort befohlen besser als eingeladen. Er hatte eine neue Idee. Eine neue Idee war nicht Seltenes von Richard. Und aus diesem Grund hat er mich und unseren Freund Richard von Weizsäcker zu diesem Frühstück eingeladen. Samantha, what I just said was that 2 decades ago, Richard Holbrook invited me and Richard von Weizsäcker to a breakfast. I pointed out that invited is not the precise word I should have used, that it was more commanded us to come to this breakfast. And he had a new idea. And as most and nearly all of his ideas, it was an important vision. For the whole period since the Second World War, Berlin had become a symbol of the defense of freedom, of the maintenance of relations between America and Europe, and particularly with Germany. It was symbolized by the airlift, the various threats of Berlin blockades, the building of the wall, and the collapse of the wall. And Richard proposed that now that the four-power administration of Berlin was ending as a result of unification and the joint efforts of Germany and the United States and other allies, that a new symbol be created. The symbol should not be a military one, but one that emphasized the cultural, intellectual, and moral relationships between our continents. And he invited Richard von Weizsäcker and me to act as honorary co-chairman. Many here will remember Dick as an extraordinary diplomat. But those of us who dealt with him recognized he was a natural force, and that to resist him was more painful than to acquiesce in his ideas. But this was a great idea that took no great effort for us to convince ourselves. And moreover, we knew that most of the hard work would be done by Richard. And that while we had extraordinary titles, it was his commitment and his dedication that made this institution what it is today. Richard von Weizsäcker pointed out that given my interest in football, that we should establish the relative rank between ourselves by the relative position of Hertha and Fürth. This was a very diplomatic proposal at the time, because it was the only time in a decade, or forever as far as I know, that Fürth had a better position than Hertha, which had been relegated to the second division at that point. But it also guaranteed that that would not be repeated very often. At any rate, this is how the structure of the academy was established, with Richard providing the inspiration and the commitment, and many others, our goodwill, our occasional assistance. And we now, at that time, there was no building. There was no program. It was a case where a vision was what created the reality. And so all the people here who made their house available, like the Arnold family, and the many others who have contributed their efforts and their goodwill, we can be very proud that on this 20th anniversary of the foundation of the Academy and the 10th anniversary of the Kissinger Prize, we have achieved this point. But actuarial tables are implacable, and many of the founders are getting older, and some have too painfully left us. The two most recent were Fritz Stern and Hans-Dietrich Genscher. Fritz Stern was a product of the generation who left Germany under difficult circumstances, but still felt so connected with the country of their birth that even after the circumstances of their departure, they always felt a special obligation and a special impulse to work together again with the Germany in which they had been brought up before the dictatorship. And it was eased by the extraordinary effort that Germany made and succeeded in becoming a democratic country dedicated to the values of the West. So now we are in a period of transition. And I want to say a few words about our current president, Gerhard Kasper. I've known Gerhard for many years, and his wife, Regina. He has been one of the great university presidents in America. And our universities have been the place where much new thinking is going on, but also where much of the anguish of America adapting itself to new circumstances has been carried out. In all these years, I have admired Gerhard for the contribution his studies of constitutional law and his interest in it has made, and his wisdom, intelligence, and always good humor. He has done us at the Academy the great honor to spend a year with us, to help guide the transition to a more permanent leadership. But also while he was here, he has made available his special contacts and his ability to bring people who have won the Nobel Prize and other distinctions to the Academy. And of course, he's been on the board of the Academy for a decade. And so he has become part of us. And I want to thank him on the behalf of the founders of this institution, but above all, of all the people here from Berlin and other places who believe in a close association between the United States and Europe, and about the very special place that Germany has in that. Gerhard, you have added distinction to this institution, and you have added insights to our lives. And you, of course, will come back here periodically. And I simply want to take this occasion to thank you on behalf of all of us for what you have contributed to the West and what you have contributed to this institution. Now, let me say a few words about the transition through which we're all going. The Academy was created at the end and in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. At that time, dividing lines were still quite clearly drawn. And when one thinks back to the immediate post-war period, one is struck by the fact that Europe, while weakened and destroyed by the war, produced a number of leaders who believed in the future of Europe and in the future of an Atlantic relationship. And out of that chaos built their nations. But now we're living in a world in which the dividing lines are not so clearly drawn. There are upheavals in almost every part of the world. And those upheavals are not carried out in the name of the same principles with which we were familiar in the immediate post-war period. That there are different causes and different solutions that are occurring, but the necessity of the coherence of the Atlantic world and of the friendship between America and Europe has become even greater. When this institution was founded and in the Cold War, we believed that the values were clearly defined. But now we have debates about idealism and realism and what should be the principal guidelines of our policy. And we have to learn that all major decisions have to be taken in time, in a time period, and that the balance is often very close. But without ideals, there can be no sense of direction. But without a realist understanding, there can only be chaos or stagnation. So those are the tasks that are before us. And for all of these reasons, it's a special joy for me that the prize this year goes to Samantha Power. I invited her to lunch when she was appointed as a UN ambassador, expecting that we would define our battle lines and then, having carried out our obligations, would observe each other from a distance. I'm proud to say that she has become a close friend, because I admire the way she has faced this challenge. There is no doubt for where Samantha stands with respect to our values. The oppressed, the displaced, those suffering offenses to human dignity know that they will have a passionate defender in Samantha, and that she does it out of faith and not simply by carrying out instructions. But she's also demonstrated in her conduct at the United Nations that she understands the imperatives of policymaking, which are that one has never or very rarely an opportunity for a perfect answer, that one always has to adjust it to some extent to circumstance, and that one has to learn to carry out ideals over a period of time and not in any one heroic effort. All of this she has done with enormous distinction and great charm. And so it is a great privilege for me to be able to welcome her here on this, the 10th anniversary of the prize. The first woman who has achieved this distinction. And again, to tell all of you how much your contribution has meant to what has been created here through the vision of Richard Holbrook some decades ago. Thank you very much for it.
The Henry A. Kissinger Prize is awarded annually to a renowned figure in the field of international diplomacy. Tonight, the American Academy in Berlin honors Samantha Power for her pursuit of a more secure, peaceful, and humane world. In her position as the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Power has worked diligently to rally the international community to respond to a multitude of global threats. From the Ebola outbreak to the rise of violent extremist groups, she has been a persistent and forceful advocate for human rights and democratic accountability. As a young journalist, Ms. Power covered the wars in the Balkans and went on to report from East Timor, Rwanda, Sudan, and Zimbabwe. She attended Harvard Law School, where she began work on what would become her first book, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, which won a Pulitzer Prize in 2003. At Harvard's Kennedy School, she was the Anna Lynn Professor of the Practice of Global Leadership and Public Policy and the founding executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. Ms. Power entered government in 2009, serving under President Obama, first as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights at the National Security Council. In 2012, the President chose her to chair the newly created Atrocities Prevention Board. On August 1st, 2013, Ms. Power was sworn in as the 28th U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Throughout her tenure, she consistently humanized the crisis that came before the United Nations. She had advanced the cause of international peace and security by securing important UN reforms, strengthening the international response to the global refugee crisis, securing important protections for women's and LGBT rights, mobilizing an unprecedented response to North Korea's destabilizing nuclear weapons program, and rallying diplomatic and peacekeeping responses to mass atrocities in sub-Saharan Africa. As is consistent with the Henry A. Kissinger Prize, Ambassador Power has not only maintained but also strengthen the transatlantic relationships crucial to responding effectively to all of these diplomatic challenges. Whether through marshaling the support needed to make UN peacekeeping missions more effective or by pushing back against a growing global crackdown on civil society. Throughout, and as the United States' voice in the world's governing body, she has been critical, forthright, and unswerving. In doing so, she has become one of the transatlantic community's most indispensable voices, as well as an inspiration for students contemplating careers in the diplomatic corps. For these reasons, Ambassador Power, on behalf of the Board of Trustees of the American Academy in Berlin, it is with great pleasure that we present you the Henry A. Kissinger Prize.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Gail and Gerhard, for your tremendous leadership of the Academy and for your moving words, both of you. And thank you, Dr. Heusgen, for your over-the-top, extremely generous remarks, and for all you have done personally to deepen the partnership, the vital partnership between our two nations. Thank you, Henry, for all of the strategic counsel that you have given me since I moved to New York, but beyond that, the simple warmth, the unusual warmth with which you have greeted me and guided me along my path. In the introduction to his book, Diplomacy, Dr. Kissinger wrote about the difference between the intellectuals who analyze international relations and the statesmen who build them. The analyst, he wrote, can choose which problem he wishes to study, whereas the statesman's problems are imposed on him. The analyst can allot whatever time is necessary to come to a clear conclusion. The overwhelming challenge to the statesman is the pressure of time. The analyst runs no risk. If his conclusions prove wrong, he can write another treatise. The statesman is permitted only one guess. His mistakes are irretrievable. The analyst has available to him all the facts. He will be judged on his intellectual power. The statesman must act on assessments that cannot be proved at the time that he is making them. He will be judged by history on the basis of how wisely he managed the inevitable change, and above all, by how well he preserves the peace. That was Dr. Kissinger in Diplomacy. After spending some 15 years as an analyst running no risk, I have since had the privilege of serving for nearly 8 years as a member of the Obama administration, where we are on the receiving end of a good deal of judgment by analysts and politicians alike. Of course, analysis and decision-making need not be mutually exclusive. It is imperative that the makers of foreign policy not wait until they have left the arena to step back from time to reflect on their decisions and the processes by which they arrived at them. As those of you who have served in such positions know, this is no easy task. Escaping the tyranny of the inbox can feel at times like trying to defy gravity. Our governments, though, must do better at creating the space where this kind of reflection can occur in real time. My beloved friend and mentor, Richard Holbrook, conceived of the American Academy partly with this purpose in mind, which is one of the many reasons that I am so honored to be here with you and to be with his co-conspirator, Kati Martin, this evening. I'm also profoundly humbled to join such a remarkable group of past recipients, as well as so many dear friends. Now, if you had told me some 15 years ago, when my first book, A Problem from Hell, came out, that I would one day be sitting behind a placard at the United Nations that says, the United States, I would not have believed you. any more than I suspect Dr. Kissinger would have believed that an award bearing his name would one day be presented to a person who had dedicated the early part of her career to documenting the US government's failure to stop genocide in the 20th century. Dr. Kissinger and I have our share of differences about American foreign policy, past and present. That is not a secret. But while our appearance here together doesn't gloss over any differences, it does speak to two striking phenomena. One is that the rise of extremist and isolationist voices in the United States has accentuated the critical importance of the fundamental internationalist assumptions that have undergirded US foreign policy across party lines since the Second World War. This includes the belief that we cannot isolate ourselves from the world's problems, and that attempting to do so will make our citizens less and not more safe. It includes the premise that our security continues to depend on investing in the transatlantic alliance of NATO, which has long bound our fates together by treating an attack on any one of our nations as an attack on us all. It includes also the view that we are better off in a world where nations are encouraged to give up rather than build up nuclear arsenals. These are foundational premises that even a few years ago one could not imagine being called into question. Now, though, those of us who hold them dear must unite in their defense. The other striking phenomenon is the one to which I would like to dedicate my remarks tonight, and that is a convergence of worldviews that once seemed irreconcilable. While pundits do still insist on foisting labels on foreign policy decision makers and thinkers, realists, idealists, liberal internationalists, and the like, these boxes have proven quite anachronistic. They obscure the inherent complexity of most contemporary policy decisions rather than illuminating a way to navigate the inevitable trade-offs that come before us. I would like here to put forward a simple thesis that once may have been controversial in a gathering like this one. And that thesis is the following. It is now objectively the case that our national interests are increasingly affected not just by what happens between states, but also what happens to people in states. Even if we all agree with Machiavelli and Dr. Kissinger that states intrinsically seek to maximize their self-interest, it is precisely that self-interest which requires us to get better at improving human security in the service of national security. The way governments treat their own citizens matters. It matters because it can have a direct impact on international peace and security and on our respective national security interests. Consider Russia, where the mothers of soldiers killed fighting in eastern Ukraine have demanded information about their sons' deaths and access to social services, only to find themselves intimidated, harassed, and in some instances even prosecuted for treason. Why? Because their sons' deaths are the clearest, most incontrovertible evidence of the Russian military's ongoing fighting in eastern Ukraine. As a result of this and similar attacks by the Russian government on independent journalists, human rights defenders, and transparency activists, the Russian people are denied knowledge of and a say in a conflict that their government is fueling, a conflict that many Russians might well oppose were they to know its true scale and costs. It's not just the Russian people who lose out when their government stifles an informed debate about its military actions. It's the world. When a global power and a permanent member of the UN Security Council flagrantly tries to expand its territory by lopping off part of a neighboring country, it weakens a core international norm that, when respected, makes all of our nations more secure. The Russian people could demand an end to these acts of aggression, but their government's censorship and repression of voices like those of the soldiers' mothers have prevented even the beginnings of a serious debate from taking place. In effect, the elimination of critical voices inside Russia helps enable acts that are profoundly destabilizing outside Russia. In countries like Venezuela and China, we see the chilling effect of government crackdowns not only on those who stand up for human rights, but also on those who challenge official narratives, including in the economic sphere. When business leaders, journalists, and economists are criticized or attacked for sharing objective information about the economy, when blog posts and news stories are censored for raising legitimate questions about inflated government production figures, dubious currency values, or corrupt officials, when fear prevents people from sharing accurate data about markets or from recommending reforms that would make them more efficient, the resulting dearth of credible innovation and the dearth of innovative ideas doesn't just undermine the economy of any one country, it threatens the stability of an ever more interconnected, regional, and even global market. In light of this, we must make a deliberate, sustained effort to understand how our policies impact and are seen by people who live inside other states. When, as a result of our policies, people in other countries see our governments as adversaries rather than allies and as enablers of repression rather than as champions of their rights, those people can take actions that significantly undermine our security. We've seen it. Take the current wave of instability roiling the Middle East. Now, some argue that the best way to combat violent extremism is by redoubling our support for the governments in the region in service of confronting terrorism. Those who urge this approach often argue, very reasonably, that these governments can be critical sources of intelligence and law enforcement cooperation, and that they possess or ought to possess a monopoly on the use of violence. However, advocates of this approach also tend to argue, less reasonably, that if only we had done more to keep the old guard in power as the Arab Spring swept across the region, order could have been preserved and much of the current turmoil could have been averted. Given the way that terrorists have exploited the conflicts that have grown out of the Arab Spring to expand their reach, to recruit new members, and to plan and execute attacks, it is not at all surprising to hear people express nostalgia for the relative stability of the pre-Arab Spring Middle East that we had all grown so used to. This argument, though, often seems to presume that the United States had it within our control to put the Arab Spring genie back in the bottle, either by somehow convincing the millions of people in the streets to accept the abusive governments that they had risked their lives trying to change, or by backing those governments as they brought to bear the tremendous force necessary to dislodge those masses from the streets. I don't believe that violence could have succeeded in beating back the popular tide that arose once people in that region had lost their fear. Rather, I think that once leaders have lost legitimacy in the eyes of the majority of their people, the question is not whether they will fall, but when, and critically, who will fill the vacuum of power when they do. We also have to acknowledge that it was repressive, corrupt rule that motivated much of the violence and unrest we see in today's Middle East. After decades of stifling the emergence of independent institutions in their societies and preventing political evolution, The Mubaraks, Gaddafis, and Ben Alis of the region set the stage for the much more disruptive revolution that is harming our interests today. Destabilizing as such revolutions are, there is nothing realistic about believing that such rulers can repress their way to governing indefinitely, or that helping them maintain their grip on power will ultimately lead to greater stability for Western democracies. In Iraq, it was the deeply sectarian, corrupt, and abusive rule of Prime Minister Maliki that drove so many Sunnis to support the ascent of ISIL as the terrorist group methodically expanded its foothold. In Syria, as we all know, no single factor has been a bigger boon for the recruitment of violent extremists than the barrel bombing, gassing, and forced starvation by the Assad regime. In Egypt, one of the greatest incubators for radicalizing individuals has been the country's appalling prisons, where thousands of peaceful protesters, political opponents, independent journalists, and countless others are now unjustly imprisoned. We have also seen that when governments commit abuses in the name of fighting terrorism, they alienate the very communities whose trust and cooperation is crucial to effectively combating extremist groups. When citizens see soldiers and police targeting innocent civilians in the name of providing security, and when they come to fear government security forces as much, in some cases, as they fear violent extremists, those citizens will have little incentive to share the information that is critical to rooting out the terrorists. So, if we accept that our interests are increasingly bound not only to those of other governments, but to the people whom they are supposed to serve, how should our foreign policy making adapt to this shift? For one, we need to broaden the spectrum of who we engage with our diplomacy. State-to-state relations matter hugely, but our intelligence and knowledge base of the people who live in those states must get much, much deeper. Diplomats need to spend more time out of the office where they can meet people affected by the policies they debate, see their impact up close, and develop the expertise and the instinct needed to help anticipate how future decisions will be experienced and interpreted by different communities. Getting up close to real people also helps puncture the inevitable abstraction that can prevent us from seeing the human consequences of our actions. This should include building relationships not only with well-known civil society organizations, but also with groups like teachers' associations, workers' unions, and leaders in the business community. And not only with the vocal majorities, but with the harder to find and hear minorities. This kind of engagement demands a more robust investment in our diplomatic efforts at a time when many governments, including my own, are facing big pressure to scale back the resources we dedicate to investments overseas and to cloister diplomats in fortress-like embassies in the parts of the world where such connections are actually needed most. So leaders must make the case to the public, not only for why we cannot isolate ourselves from these problems, but also why we must broaden the scope of our diplomatic engagement as a national security imperative. If one way to respond to this shift is through this thicker engagement in and knowledge of the world beyond our own borders, another is through investing more deeply in the partnerships and capacities needed to confront contemporary threats that by their very nature require a global response. The need for alliances is, of course, nothing new. As Dr. Kissinger's masterwork, Diplomacy, makes clear, for as long as the state has existed, diplomats have recognized the need to build partnerships beyond borders to achieve their goals and protect their interests. But what is distinct about many of the problems we face today is that a coalition or alliance of powerful countries cannot solve most of those problems. For climate change to be stopped and for its myriad economic, security, and environmental consequences to be averted, it's not enough just for the United States and Europe to bring down our emissions. To prevent terrorists from attacking our citizens, we cannot simply keep them from gaining a foothold in the countries that are our partners. And to stop an outbreak of a deadly virus from turning into a global pandemic, we must do more than build up robust public health systems at home. With each of these threats, a single weak link in the chain, even in an extremely remote part of the world, can put the security of our citizens at risk. That is why the Obama administration has poured so much energy into building broader, deeper coalitions that can shore up all the links in the chain, whether that is by persuading countries like China and India to join the Paris Agreement on climate change this year, or working to help ensure that the forces fighting Boko Haram, ISIL's new branch, do not themselves abuse local populations, creating in the process more terrorists than they defeat. Or training more doctors and nurses in West Africa so that the next Ebola outbreak in the region does not reach the devastating proportions of the last one. And yet, and I think this is the spirit of Dr. Kissinger and Dr. Heusgen's remarks, there are some foreign policy dilemmas for which deepening our diplomatic engagement and marshaling global coalitions will not offer a solution, such as when the aspirations of the people in a given country cut against our longstanding relationship with its government, or when we suspect that exerting pressure on a government to move toward a more open, rights-respecting system may actually undermine the limited influence that we have. This is not a hypothetical balancing act. It is one that is playing out right now in our relationships with countries across the world. And I wish that we had here tonight the magic formula to navigate these conundrums. We do not. It is a challenge we continue to grapple with imperfect results. But we must never be ashamed to ask whether we have been too reticent in pressing certain governments to reform and to respond to the demands of their citizens. Remember, evolution is far preferable to revolution. Or whether we have pushed so hard that we have caused governments to distance themselves from us, forfeiting access that might have more gradually allowed us to achieve our desired end, and maybe squandering our chances of working together to address a shared challenge. What is certainly not the solution for the contemporary diplomat is to act as if these dilemmas do not exist, or to continue to make foreign policy as though relations between governments were all that mattered. It is indisputable that the motivation of states and the actions of governments matter immensely. But we no longer live in an era in which foreign policymakers can claim to serve their nation's interests by treating what happens to people in other countries as an afterthought. The foreign policy equation has changed. What happens to people in other countries matters. It matters to the welfare of our own nations and our own citizens. The sooner that we can unite in recognition of this fact, the sooner we can sharpen the foreign policy tools that we can use to advance this increasingly complex agenda, the better off our citizens, our nations, and the indispensable transatlantic partnership will be. Thank you.